Hey guys, today we are going to conquer inputs in Python. And to do that, we have to go through a few things. So first of all, we will look at the input function, which is a new function. And then last lesson, we looked at variables. And this lesson, what we want to do is look at how to store the inputs that we take from a user under a variable. How do we assign it? And then at the same time, we're going to have to look at different data types. So we've looked at string already in our previous videos. This lesson, we're going to look at integers and floats. And we're going to touch on the programming paradigm of sequence, and then we're going to look at what concatenation is, which is just a fancy word for join. So let's crack on. This lesson, we're going to introduce the new function, which is input, okay? And as you can tell, because of the parenthesis, because there are parentheses, we know this is a function, okay? And what we want to do is take input from a user, and we want to store that using a variable, okay? So it's very straightforward. We've done this before. Let's do an example. Here what I want to do is I want to touch on the programming paradigm of sequence. So generally all programming languages, or most programming languages, run line by line in sequence. Okay, so the programming paradigm you have to remember is sequence, which basically means that Python in this case is going to read line 1, then it's going to read line 2, and then it will move to line 3. Okay. Now there are exceptions to that, and when we look at the other programming paradigms, that will make more sense. But the idea of sequence is that programs are read line by line. Now what happens here is we've got an input, and so what Python does is Python should pause. It should read the first line, read the second line, and then it should pause and not print the third line out until we have um, until we have given an input, given our user input. So let's run and let's try this out. So you can see it says hello. Then it says what's your name, and let's type in Eric. It will when we hit enter. Oh, by the way, you can see that it didn't print line 3. Now when I hit enter, then it should move on to line 3. Okay, but there's a problem here. There's a problem. I've got an input. I've made an input, but that input wasn't stored anywhere. Okay, so there's nowhere for that to be stored. So really, it's kind of vanished, right? So what I want to do is I want to say name equals input. So what I'm doing now is I'm assigning the input function to the name variable. So when the user gives their input, it's going to store it. Okay, and now what we can do is we can also rather than saying by, let's just print name out. Okay, so if I run that again, it says hello, what's your name? I'll say Eric, and I'll hit enter, and you can see now because we stored that input somewhere, we can print it out. All right, we can output that. So here's where the next problem comes. All right, so we're learning as we go along. And now what I want to do is I want to take inputs that are a number. Okay, so off camera, I've made a couple of changes here. And this time what I've done is I've got a variable named number, and I've got an input here that asks the user to enter a number. And then when we print, what we're doing here is we're using the print function to do more than just output strings. We're getting it to evaluate 2 plus something else, some other number that's input. Okay, so as you can see from this example, Python can also do basic maths. Okay, so when I run this, I am going to get an error. So it works at this point. If I was to enter 2 and hit enter, now I get an error. Okay, so the thing we're learning now is that our input function, by default, all inputs are a string. You can see that here, right? It says unsupported operand types for int and string. And as you can see, this part here is an integer, but this part, the default input, like I said, is a string data type. So what Python is telling us is it can't deal with two different types of objects. It has to deal with the same. Okay? Sorry, I didn't mean to say Python can't deal with two different types of objects. I mean the print function can't deal with more than two different types of objects. So it has to deal with either two integers or two strings and so on and so forth, right? So we're giving a number and we want it to output a number. So to do that, we're going to come across a new skill. In fact, what I'll do here is I'm going to write these down. I'm going to comment here that int is equal to integer. So now what we're going to learn is the int function is used to convert a string into an integer, okay? And the float function, which we're going to come to in a second, is equal to, a number with decimals, all right? So now what I want to do is I want to use that new function and I want to cast. So what that does is that converts. So we're going to say int, and I want you to think about the way in maths how we evaluate what's in the brackets first. Okay, so what Python's going to do here is Python is going to take our input. Okay, it's going to evaluate our input. It's going to store that data. Then we're going to take that and we're going to cast it into an integer, and then we're going to take that and we're going to store it under our variable number. So you can see what's going on here, right? So now when I click on run, let's click on run. Oh. Now when I click on run and I add 2, it evaluates here that it's 2 plus 2. So what's happened is we've taken our string data type here, we've converted it to an integer, and then we've output. Let's try another one. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to say, right, let's add 2.5 to 2. So when we hit enter, now we get another error. And what it's saying here is it can't take that input and it can't make 2.5 into an integer. It can't take a number with decimal point, 2.5, and convert that into a whole number. What does it do? Does it convert it to 2, to 3? So then at this point we use the float data type. So now if we run the same thing again, 2.5, oops, let's say 2.5 to 2 add 2.5 equals 4.5, which we can see now works, right? So let's just do one more thing. Okay, let me introduce you to one more small function, and that function is called the type function. It outputs the type of data that we're entering. Okay, so let me get rid of this calculation here, and let's cut that for 1 second. And what we'll do is we'll say type, and inside the type parenthesis, we want to evaluate what number is. So whatever the user enters, we want to evaluate what kind of type it is. Okay, so now I'll run it again. Now we'll evaluate that. When I click on 2.5, enter, the output is that it gives me a type, and it tells me here that the type of this data is a float. Okay. Now, if I was to run the same thing and not put 2.5 and just put in 2, it still says float, even though there's no decimal number. That's because this is converting into a float, right? And if I was to convert to an integer or cast to an integer, then it will say int for integer object. But I just want to show you this again. So if we take any number or any input, okay, so whether it's a word or like if I was to take a number and hit enter, okay, the type of data is still string. So like I said, the default data type is a string for an input. Okay, we want to do one more thing. Let's again cast to an integer like that. We'll get rid of these for now. I think you know what they are. And by the way, I'll add these descriptions into underneath the video. You're going to see a link to our webpage, and in the webpage, I'll summarize what we've learned, and we'll speak about the data types that you've learned. Okay, so let's get rid of that. And this time, what I want to do is I want to join, or in other words, concatenate. Okay, so it's just a fancy word, but it just means join. Okay, so what I'll say is you entered the number. Oh gosh. You entered the number, and we'll leave a space there, and we'll say plus, and then number. Okay. Now, at this point, like I said, Python can't deal with two types of data at once. Okay, so I've got a string object here, and I'm using the plus button to concatenate, or in other words, to join together. And we're joining together this object, which is, as we know, it's an integer object. So we should get an error. Let's enter the number 2 or 25. And look, it's saying here, can only concatenate string, not integer to string. So it started with a string, it has to join other string objects. So now what we'll do is we'll look at the last function that we're going to learn today, which is the string casting function. So now what this will do is it will take that number and it will cast it, convert it into a string, like we said, do you remember what we talked about with maths? We said in bid maths, we evaluate what's between the brackets first, for emphasis. Then we can join it to our other object, and now they're both string objects. So now when we do this, now when we run again, and we'll say 25, and we hit enter. Okay, so I don't know why my window crashed, but I've just quickly typed that out again. Let's run it one more time, and this time when we enter the number 25, we can see that it's outputted perfectly, and it's joining the two objects together, right? So I think that brings us to the end of this video. Please remember to like and subscribe. And like I said, in the description, you'll find a summary of what we learned today on our webpage and lots of practice tasks. So do check it out. See you in the next video.